I never thought my life would come down to one rusty key. When my father passed away, everyone said my older brother Mark was destined to inherit everything. And he did. Our father's $45 million mansion on the hill, the garage filled with Teslas, Mercedes, and even a vintage '67 Mustang that Dad polished every Sunday. The family applauded him like a king while I was handed a single, corroded key. They laughed in my face, whispered that Dad gave me junk because I was a failure, a disappointment. I wanted to disappear, but when I pressed that key into an old warehouse lock on the edge of town, the door groaned open, and what I found inside exposed the truth my family had hidden for decades. And in that moment I realized, sometimes the smallest gift can shatter the biggest lies. But what I didn't know was, the church smelled of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that clings to funerals. I sat in the third pew, hands folded tightly, my head bowed low as relatives whispered their condolences to my brother. Mark. He wore a tailored black Armani suit, his Rolex catching the light every time he shook another hand. He looked like the heir he always believed he was. Me? I felt like the ghost no one wanted to acknowledge. My tie was borrowed, my shoes scuffed, and my divorce had stripped me of the last shred of dignity I thought I had left. People glanced at me the way you glance at an empty chair, there but irrelevant. When the service ended, the family gathered in the grand hall of St. John's for the reading of the will. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation, like a royal coronation. My heart thudded in my chest, though I already knew how this would go. Dad always favored Mark, the golden boy. I was the afterthought, the disappointment. Still, some small, desperate part of me hoped. The lawyer, a thin man with silver glasses, opened a leather case and began to read. His voice carried like a judge's verdict. To my eldest son, Mark, I leave the family estate, valued at $45 million, along with its contents, the cars in the garage, the collection of Rolex watches, and all personal effects contained therein. Gasps, applause, murmurs of approval. Mark nodded with practiced solemnity, though a smug smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He had just inherited a kingdom. And to my younger son, Ethan. The lawyer paused, clearing his throat as if embarrassed. I leave this. He lifted a small brown envelope, no thicker than a grocery receipt. He handed it to me. I opened it with trembling hands, and inside was a single rusty key. The room erupted in whispers. Laughter bubbled up from cousins, uncles, even old family friends. Someone muttered loud enough for me to hear. Even his father knew he was worthless. My face burned. I wanted to vanish into the floor. Mark chuckled, leaning close enough to stab me with his words. A rusty key? Maybe it opens the janitor's closet. Seems fitting. The humiliation was complete. I could feel the weight of every eye in the room, judging me, mocking me. My chest tightened as if invisible hands were pressing me down, suffocating me under years of failure. I shoved the envelope into my jacket pocket, forcing myself not to break in front of them. My father, had given me nothing but a piece of corroded metal. But as I looked down at the key, rough and cold in my palm, something flickered inside me. Dad wasn't careless. He was deliberate. Every decision, every gesture had meaning. I clenched my fist around it. Why would Dad leave me this, I whispered to myself, unless he wanted me to find something? That was the moment I realized Dad had left me a riddle, not a rejection. Mark always knew how to shine in a room. Even as kids, he had that smile that made teachers bend the rules, that charm that earned him favors from coaches and neighbors. I was the kid with scraped knees and dirty hands, building things in the backyard, while Mark was shaking hands with Dad's business partners at 10 years old. I remember one Christmas vividly. Dad bought Mark a brand new Schwinn bike, cherry red with chrome handlebars. I got a set of used tools wrapped in newspaper. Dad said, "Ethan, you're better with your hands anyway." At the time, I convinced myself it was love in his own way, but looking back, I knew it was a reminder. Mark was the heir. I was the helper. Now, standing in the grand marble hall of the mansion that was officially Mark's, I watched as waiters carried trays of champagne and caviar. Family friends toasted him like he had just been crowned king. A crystal chandelier glimmered above his head, reflecting in the polished floor like a spotlight on the chosen son. I stood in the shadows, clutching the envelope in my pocket. My throat burned with humiliation. No one even looked at me. They orbited around Mark as if I didn't exist. Mark spotted me across the room. He raised his glass in mock salute and sauntered over, the Rolex on his wrist catching every light. "Well, little brother," he said, leaning close enough for me to smell the champagne on his breath. "Did you figure out what that key's for yet?" I stayed silent. He smirked wider. "Maybe it opens a broom closet. Seems about right for you." His laughter was sharp, deliberate, like a knife twisting into my ribs. A few nearby relatives chuckled along, not daring to cross the golden child. I looked around the hall. $45 million of marble floors, leather sofas, and hand-painted portraits of our ancestors. All his now. And me? I was the shadow, the forgotten son, the man everyone whispered about as a failure. Moments later, Uncle Richard clinked his glass and shouted, "To Mark, the true heir, just like his father wanted." The room erupted in cheers. Champagne spilled, laughter echoed, and for a second it felt like the whole world was celebrating my brother while I stood invisible. I forced myself to swallow the bitterness rising in my throat. I could feel my face heating, shame battling with anger. My father's voice echoed in my memory. Deliberate, measured, always leaving layers behind his actions. He wasn't careless. He never was. Mark thought the key was worthless. They all did. But deep down, a flicker of doubt gnawed at me. What if the joke wasn't on me? I reached into my pocket, fingers tightening around the jagged edges of the rusty key. I leaned closer to myself, almost afraid to say it aloud, but the words slipped out in a whisper only I could hear. But what if Dad was smarter than all of them? What none of them knew was that the joke wasn't on me. The mansion's lights and laughter faded into the night behind me, but their echoes followed me like shadows. I drove back to my small apartment in silence, the rusty key heavy in my pocket as if it carried more weight than its size should allow. When I shut the door behind me, the loneliness pressed in. The peeling paint on the walls, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint draft through the cracked window, it all reminded me of what I didn't have. But as I sat at the table and pulled the envelope back out, a memory stirred. Grandma Rose. She had passed away years before Dad, but her words lingered more than his ever did. I could still see her sitting on the porch in her faded floral dress, sipping tea and humming old hymns. I was 13, raw from another one of Dad's scoldings when she called me over. "Ethan," she said, her voice soft but steady, "when others see nothing in you, that's when you're holding the biggest secret." I frowned at her back then, not really understanding. "But everyone says Mark is better. Dad says I'll never measure up." She placed her weathered hand over mine. "Your father measures with money, and Mark measures with pride. But life doesn't keep score the way they do. Sometimes the most valuable things are buried under dust, waiting for the right hands to find them." Her eyes sparkled when she leaned close. "Remember, child, keys don't just open doors. They open truths." The words hit me differently now, decades later, sitting in that dim apartment. A chill ran down my spine. Could she have known? Was she hinting at this moment, at this key? For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than shame or anger. It was small, fragile, but undeniable. Hope. I pulled the key out again, studying it under the yellow kitchen light. The rust clung to its grooves, but as I turned it, something caught my eye. Along the flat edge were faint etchings I hadn't noticed before. Numbers. Tiny, almost invisible unless the light hits just right. I leaned closer, my breath quickening. 27, 14, 36. It wasn't random. They lined up like coordinates or a code, something deliberate, intentional. My heart pounded. Dad didn't leave me a worthless trinket. He left me a message. I traced the numbers with my thumb, a spark igniting inside me. All those whispers, all the laughter, they didn't know. Mark didn't know. But Grandma had been right all along. "When others see nothing in you," she had said, "that's when you're holding the biggest secret." I stared at the key, the etchings clearer now, the envelope still on the table beside me. Coordinates? A code? I whispered to the empty room. My pulse raced. What was Dad trying to tell me? If I had looked closer, I would have seen the numbers carved into the key. Mark didn't waste any time turning grief into glory. Barely a week after Dad's funeral, the invitations went out, a family memorial and gathering at the mansion. Everyone knew what it really was, a coronation for the golden child. I almost stayed home, but something gnawed at me, the same pull that made me slip into my worn thrift store jacket and drive over anyway. When I walked through the mansion's massive oak doors, the world hit me like a spotlight. Men in sharp tuxedos, women dripping in diamonds, champagne glasses raised high. A string quartet played in the corner while the chandeliers rained light across marble floors. The smell of cigars and cologne filled the air, and there was Mark, front and center, Armani suit tailored to perfection, Dad's platinum Rolex gleaming like a crown jewel. He looked like he belonged there, like this house, this fortune, this moment had been waiting for him all along. Uncle Richard clinked his glass. To Mark, heir of his father's empire. The room erupted in cheers, laughter, and applause. I stood at the back, invisible, my jacket too loose at the shoulders, my shoes too scuffed to reflect in that polished marble. Mark caught sight of me, and of course he couldn't resist. He raised his glass and said, voice dripping with mockery, "Ladies and gentlemen, let's not forget my brother, Ethan. He too inherited something from our dear father." Dozens of eyes turned toward me. My throat went dry. Mark's smirk widened. A key, a single, rusty key, probably opens a broom closet. He lifted his glass higher. To Ethan, the keeper of nothing. Laughter thundered through the hall, echoing off every marble column, bouncing back into my chest until I thought I might collapse under the weight of it. My face burned, my fists clenched in my pockets where the key pressed sharply against my palm. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't stay. I turned and slipped out quietly, the laughter still ringing in my ears. Outside, the night was colder than I expected. The mansion glowed behind me, full of champagne and sneers while I stood alone on the gravel driveway. I pulled the key out, stared at it under the moonlight, the etched numbers faint but unmistakable. They thought it was worthless. Maybe I wanted to believe that too. But something about the weight of it, the precision of those etchings, it wasn't random. My chest tightened. That's when I heard it, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. A man in a black coat stepped out from the shadows near the gate. His face was half hidden, but his voice was calm, certain. "Ethan," he said, extending a small package wrapped in worn paper. "Your father wanted me to give you something." The man stepped closer, his black coat brushing against the gravel as the party noise faded behind me. His face came into view, lined, sharp, but calm in a way that made me tense even more. "My name is Mr. Collins," he said, his tone low but firm. "I was your father's lawyer. Not the one who handled the public will, but his private affairs." I frowned. "I already heard the will. I got this." I held up the rusty key like proof of my humiliation. Mr. Collins shook his head. "That was only the surface. Your father had layers. He left you something else, something he didn't want anyone else to see." From inside his coat, he pulled out a folded piece of yellowed paper, creased at the edges like it had been carried for years. He placed it in my hand. I opened it slowly, my pulse thundering. In my father's familiar handwriting were only 10 words. "The key is only the beginning. Trust no one." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Trust no one. My mind flashed to Mark, to the laughter in that hall, to the whispers of my relatives. Had Dad known what was coming all along? Collins handed me another slip of paper, an address scribbled in ink. "Your father gave me this before he passed. He told me to deliver it to you and you alone. It's an old warehouse on the industrial side of town. You'll understand when you get there." I stared at him, suspicion gnawing at me. Why would he do this? Why not leave it in the official will? "Because the official will was never safe," Collins replied, eyes narrowing. "Your father knew exactly how greedy this family could be. That's why he chose you." His words rattled around in my head like loose bolts. I wanted to believe him, but another voice whispered that it could all be a cruel trick. Mark, or someone else, is setting me up for another humiliation. Collins must have seen the doubt on my face. "I can't force you, Ethan, but your father trusted you for a reason. Don't waste that trust." He pressed my hand closed around the note and stepped back into the shadows, leaving me standing alone in the cold night with a key, a warning, and an address. The drive home was a blur. My old sedan rattled as the city lights thinned out into empty streets. Each red light, each passing mile, I questioned if I was out of my mind. But curiosity, no, something deeper than curiosity, kept my hands on the wheel. By the time the factory smokestacks rose against the moonlight, my nerves were on fire. The warehouse loomed ahead, rust eating its walls, broken windows staring like hollow eyes. I parked, gripping the key so hard my hand ached. My heart hammered as I approached the rusted lock on the steel door. The key slid in, stiff at first, then turned with a heavy click. The door creaked open into darkness. And that's when everything changed. The warehouse swallowed me in silence as the heavy door creaked shut behind me. Dust floated in the faint beams of moonlight cutting through the cracked windows. The air smelled of rust, oil, and something older, like secrets sealed away for decades. My footsteps echoed on the concrete as I moved deeper inside. Rows of crates lined the walls, some stacked high, others slumped and broken. Old shelves leaned under the weight of files and boxes, their labels faded, their contents hidden. I reached for the nearest crate, prying the lid with trembling hands. Inside were thick folders sealed with wax stamps. I brushed away the dust and flipped one open. What I saw stopped my breath. Deeds, contracts, legal papers tied to real estate projects all across the state, high-rise apartments, commercial plazas, and entire blocks of land. Properties worth tens of millions, all listed under holding companies, all tied back to my father's name. I grabbed another folder, then another. The numbers hit me like a tidal wave. $12 million here, $35 million there, $73 million in a coastal development. In total, the assets stacked up to well over $120 million, and none of it had been mentioned in the official will. My knees nearly buckled. What is this?" I whispered, my voice echoing in the cavernous room. I kept flipping, my heart racing. Then I froze. Tucked inside one folder were photographs. I pulled them out carefully, my hands shaking. They weren't just any pictures. They were of me, 10 years old, standing next to Dad in this very warehouse. My hair messy, my smile wide, my father's hand resting proudly on my shoulder. Tears blurred my vision. My father had brought her long before Mark was ever in the picture. He had shown me this place, trusted me with it, though I had been too young to understand. I sank onto a wooden crate, clutching the photos to my chest as memories crashed over me. All those years of hearing I was the disappointment. All those dinners where Dad praised Mark. All the lectures where he told me I'd never measure up. Was it all a mask? Had he hidden the truth even from them, waiting for me to find it? Anger surged through the grief. My brother Sis sipping champagne in a mansion he didn't earn. My relatives laughed while I held this key, believing it meant nothing. And yet, hope flickered. For the first time in years, I felt the ground shift under my feet. Maybe I wasn't the worthless son after all. Maybe Dad had trusted me more than anyone realized. I stared at the stack of documents, the photographs, the proof. My chest rose and fell with heavy breaths. The weight of it all pressed down, but underneath that weight was fire. I whispered into the still air, my voice trembling but fierce. If this is real, then Mark's entire empire is built on a lie. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By morning, I was running on nothing but adrenaline and rage. The documents, the deeds, the photographs, they were stacked neatly in a leather satchel I hadn't used in years. It felt like I was carrying dynamite, and the fuse was already lit. When I pushed open the mansion doors, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses hit me like a slap. Mark and the rest of the family were gathered in the grand hall, lounging around as though they had just conquered Rome. My mother sat primly near the fireplace, pearls around her neck, sipping tea like a queen. Mark looked up, irritation flashing in his eyes. "Well, look who it is. The janitor of our bloodline." His smirk returned. "What is it this time, Ethan? Come to show us your key again?" I dropped the satchel onto the marble floor with a heavy thud. Every head turned. Slowly, I unzipped it and pulled out the stack of documents, spreading them across the glass coffee table. The crisp sound of paper hitting the surface cut through the smug chatter. "These," I said, my voice raw, "are Dad's real legacy." Mark chuckled, glancing at the pages without touching them. "Fake. Obvious forgeries. You're desperate, Ethan. Everyone knows it." Mother leaned forward, her lips curling in disdain. "Honestly, Ethan, it's pathetic. Your father pitied you, so you've concocted this little fantasy. Do you really think we'd believe you could hold a fortune like this?" My hands shook, but not from fear, from fury. I slammed the photographs down on top of the contracts. The room went silent. There it was, Dad and me in that warehouse, his hand on my shoulder, both of us smiling. The photos were dated, stamped, undeniable. Mark's face paled, his smug grin faltering. No, this doesn't prove anything." His voice cracked, betraying the panic rising in his chest. The family erupted. Uncles muttering, cousins gasping, aunts whispering fiercely among themselves. Questions, doubts, chaos filling the room like a storm breaking. Mark lunged forward, grabbing the papers, his hands trembling. "You'll never take this from me," he shouted, spit flying, veins bulging in his neck. "Do you hear me? Never!" I stood my ground, staring him down, my jaw set. "It was never yours to begin with." The air grew heavier, the tension unbearable. And then a new voice cut through the chaos. "Actually," came a steady tone from the doorway, "Ethan has the rightful claim." Everyone turned. There stood Mr. Collins, my father's private lawyer, framed by the golden light of the morning sun. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a stack of papers in the other. His presence silenced the room instantly. Mark's face twisted with fury. Mother's teacup rattled against its saucer. Collins stepped forward, his gaze fixed on me. "And I have the signed proof." The room froze as Mr. Collins set his briefcase on the coffee table, right on top of the papers I'd thrown down. His presence carried the kind of authority that silenced even the loudest voices in the family. Mark's face was flushed crimson. "He's lying. This is a stunt, a setup. Don't listen to him." But Collins didn't even look at him. His calm, measured voice filled the hall. "Your father, God rest his soul, was a complicated man. The official you heard at the funeral was deliberately incomplete." Gasps rippled through the room. Collins clicked open the briefcase, pulling out a thick, sealed envelope. He held it up for everyone to see, the Crestwood family seal pressed deep into the wax. "This," he said, "is a codicil, an amendment to the will, signed by your father, witnessed and notarized in my office." He broke the seal with deliberate care, sliding out a stack of typed pages. His eyes scanned the room before settling on me. "In this codicil, your father states clearly, due to concerns over Mark's judgment and integrity, the hidden estate, properties, trusts, and holdings amounting to over $120 million are to pass solely to Ethan Rohr." The air was sucked out of the room. Aunt Linda gasped, clutching her pearls. My uncle muttered a curse under his breath. Cousins exchanged wide-eyed glances. Even Mother sat frozen, her teacup slipping from her fingers and shattering on the marble floor. Mark staggered back, his voice cracking. "No, this can't be real. He loved me. He trusted me. This is fake. I'll sue." Collins remained steady. "You can try, but your father's signature is here. His notary is here, and his reasoning is documented in his own words." He feared greed would poison his legacy. And now, sadly, his fears seemed justified. Mark lunged forward, his hand trembling as he grabbed the codicil, scanning it with wild eyes. His lips moved as he read the words, each one stripping him bare. Finally, he threw the papers down with a guttural scream. "Betrayal!" The family erupted into shouts and accusations, chaos boiling over like a pot left on the flame too long. But I stood still, every muscle tight, every breath heavy. Because for the first time in my life, I felt it. Validation. My father hadn't abandoned me. He hadn't seen me as worthless. He had trusted me. Me, not Mark. My throat tightened, my eyes burning with tears I refused to shed in front of them. I clenched the key in my hand, feeling its grooves press into my palm like a promise kept. Then Colin's gaze locked on me, his voice low but cutting through the noise. "Ethan," he said, "your father left you this fortune for a reason. But with it comes something else. A secret he died protecting." The room fell silent again. Even Mark stopped mid-rant, his eyes darting between us. A chill spread through me. The fortune was mine, yes, but Colin's words told me one thing. The real storm hadn't even started. The codicil wasn't the end. It was only the spark. Collins wasn't finished. From his briefcase, he pulled another folder, this one thick with ledgers, contracts, and bank slips. He laid them out on the table like a prosecutor in court. "Your father left records," he said firmly, "of Mark's embezzlement. Millions siphoned out of company accounts into shell corporations. Money funneled to fuel his cars, his vacations, his reckless gambling." The room erupted in gasps. Mark's face turned pale, sweat dripping down his temples. "Lies, all lies. He's framing me." Colin's voice never wavered. "Every transaction has your name. Every account has your signature. The warehouse was more than storage. It was a vault of truth, and Ethan, holding that key, was the only one your father trusted to uncover it." I watched as my brother unraveled. The same man who had sneered at me in the mansion ballroom, who had been toasted with champagne while I stood in the shadows, now looked like a cornered thief. By the next morning, detectives arrived. They combed through the warehouse, gathering files, hard drives, and evidence so airtight that not even Mark's expensive lawyers could wriggle him free. Within days, the story broke. Local business mogul under investigation for fraud. Cameras swarmed the gates of the mansion. Paparazzi captured the moment police escorted Mark out in handcuffs. His once proud head bowed in shame. The empire he'd flaunted gone. The cars were repossessed, the mansion seized, accounts frozen. All that glitter he'd waved in my face crumbled to dust overnight. And me? For the first time, the world looked at me differently. Business partners, once dismissive, now shook my hand with respect. Old employees who had whispered behind my back now sought me out, saying, "Your dad always said you were the one with integrity." I reopened Dad's company, not under Mark's corruption, but with honesty. Contracts returned. Clients re-signed. Workers showed up with hope in their eyes again. It felt less like an inheritance and more like a resurrection. The family who had mocked me, who had whispered that I was worthless, sat silent now. At dinners, no one dared smirk. At gatherings, no one dared laugh. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was the one carrying Dad's true legacy. Vindication was sweet, but it wasn't the sweetness of revenge. It was the relief of truth finally surfacing after years buried under lies. Late one evening, I walked through the empty halls of the reclaimed company office. My steps echoed against the marble floors as I stopped before my father's portrait. His eyes, captured in that painting, seemed to follow me. I whispered, "You knew. You saw through him. And you trusted me when no one else did." My throat tightened. I reached into my pocket, pulling out the old rusty key, the one that had started it all. I clenched it in my hand, my chest heavy not with anger, but with gratitude. Then I looked back up at his portrait, and the question hit me harder than anything else. But the greatest truth wasn't money. It was why Dad chose me. For weeks after Mark's downfall, the headlines blared about the scandal, the fortune, the family torn apart. But when the cameras left and the noise faded, I was left alone with one simple object. The rusty key. That key had been my humiliation in front of the family. The thing they laughed at. The proof that I was worthless. And yet it became the door to the truth. Not just about my father's fortune, but about myself. I spent nights sitting by my window, holding it in my palm, reflecting on the years I had wasted believing I was nothing. All my life I measured my worth by what others said, by Mark's shadow, by Mother's scorn, by neighbors who whispered. But my father had seen something different. He knew the world would doubt me, so he left me the one thing that would prove my value beyond question. All my life, I whispered, I thought I was worthless. That rusty key proved I was always trusted. With the inheritance secured, I had choices. I didn't buy the biggest mansion or the flashiest cars. Instead, I bought a modest house by the coast, somewhere quiet, somewhere real. I reopened Dad's company not to flaunt wealth, but to give honest work to the men and women who had once stood beside him. More than that, I reached beyond myself. I funded scholarships for kids who, like me, had been told they weren't enough. I helped my neighbor, a struggling single mother, repair her home and get back on her feet. I donated to charities that built community centers in places most people forgot. Because the real inheritance wasn't the money. It was self-worth. It was the realization that I had always been more than the labels pinned to me. And as I sat one evening staring at my father's portrait hanging in the office, I finally understood. The greatest truth, I said softly, wasn't the wealth you left me. It was the faith you placed in me. The camera in my mind pulled back then. The broken son turned builder. The forgotten heir turned guardian of a legacy. And to you, watching this story, I leave one thought. If life hands you a rusty key while everyone else gets mansions, don't throw it away. It might just unlock the truth that changes everything.